Okay, so we will pick up kind of where we left off. So I've got a couple things to mention before we get going. So just as a reminder, we've got that Canvas discussion, so that's due at the end of the day on Monday. Um, you've got those daily quizzes, so I'll post the grades to this one. It was due before class today. This one isn't due until we start class on Monday. So this daily quiz is due before we start class. It kind of crosses over the weekend. I always give you kind of two class periods, which is why that one's extended a little bit. You then have that quiz number 3. So that should be available to you currently right now, similar to the other ones. Once you start, you'll have 60 minutes. That's 60 minutes. That means you must start it by 10:59 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Once again, everything I say in this class is Eastern Standard Time. Okay. Um, Other than that, we'll kind of work on with these PowerPoint and this Excel file today. Um, don't think there's any other housekeeping things I wanted to mention before we get going. I'll kind of add in this daily quiz that we'll kind of have today. And then we should be kind of ready to start. So unless there's any other questions for me, we'll kind of dive into material here. Okay, so let's start out here. All right. So I think as far as we got yesterday was thinking about we've got these different levels of consumption, right? We talked about I can calculate my averages, I can calculate the marginal kind of consumption or the marginal propensity to consume, marginal propensity to save. That's going to represent the change in consumption that comes from a change in our disposable income. So this is the idea. Just because we have $100 more, we don't just buy products with that. We might save some of it. Okay. So we're going to be really focusing on consumption. And we then said, okay, the actual level of consumption may not always be the same as our disposable income, right? Because we save, right, some of our income. Also, there's a certain amount of money initially, even if I have $0 of disposable income, when we were looking at that consumption function, even if disposable income is 0, there's a constant amount that we're going to have to spend. Essentially, I said to think about this as like food, um, housing, things that we just need to, stay alive, so to speak, right? So if I don't have any disposable income, I might take loans out so that I can kind of cover those expenses, which is why sometimes consumption is greater than our income, which would mean we have dis-savings, right? Or our savings are negatives. There's also going to be a level where the actual consumption is below kind of our disposable income. If that's the case, that means that what we're spending is less than how much money we're making. We must have a positive amount of savings. So there's going to be a point in the middle, which we'll kind of call our break-even income point. So we can think about this in context of consumers, but this is also going to apply to the economy as a whole, right? Because we think about any one consumer, their decisions add up to be the entire economy. So we're going to think about how do we find this break-even point, or essentially, where is all of consumption equal to all of income? This would be like our real GDP equilibrium, if you want to think about it that way. Okay. So with that idea in mind, right, how do we find this break-even point? So if we have an actual consumption function, once again, we can think of this as the break-even level of consumption. We'll eventually kind of talk about, we can translate this into real GDP. But let's say here's my consumption function. Okay. Now, the general form, we said the slope, as my disposable income changes, the slope or the change in consumption, well, the change in consumption from a change in disposable income, we said last class, that was our marginal propensity to consume. The thing that gets added in, or our constant, was that amount of spending we had to have if disposable income was 0. So we're going to call this autonomous consumption. Okay. So in a consumption function, if I asked you in a quiz or an exam, what is the autonomous consumption? It would be 0.7. What is our marginal propensity to consume? 0.8. As kind of a follow-up, if we know the marginal propensity to consume, what does the marginal propensity to save have to be? Well, all we can do with our income is either consume products or spend, or sorry, consume products or save. So those two should always add up to one. So if I know my marginal propensity to consume is 0.8, my marginal propensity to save must be 0.2. So in a problem, I could give you the marginal propensity to save. That's not our slope. Our slope is the marginal propensity to consume. And so I would have to do 1 minus that. So how do I find this break-even level of actual consumption, right? Given a certain amount of disposable income, what is my consumption? And then think about it, what would the break-even level be? So we'll kind of work through two examples like that. So we've got this consumption function. So just to kind of hit on some points that I might have already mentioned, but kind of be complete in this answer. So this was our marginal propensity to consume. So yeah, make sure I hit record. This is going to be our autonomous consumption. Okay. So I could do something like, let's say my disposable income, or YD here, let's say that was, I don't know, 5.4. How would I find my overall level of consumption? Well, consumption is equal to my marginal propensity to consume. I'm spending essentially 80% or 0.8 of that disposable income. And then I have this autonomous consumption as well. Okay. So if I'm doing the math there, kind of pull this over so I make sure I'm not doing anything, making any math errors in my head here. So get this set up for the rest of class. So we've got what? 0.8 times 5.4 plus 0.7 gives us approximately 5.02. Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Now, how would I find my break-even level of consumption? So I'm going to do this with the numbers here in a second. But if I was just doing this in general form, sorry, trying to get my ringer turned off here so you guys don't have to listen to that. Times my disposable income plus this autonomous consumption amount. Well, if I want to solve for the break-even point, that's going to be where my consumption is equal to that disposable income, right? That point where they cross. So essentially, if these are the same value, I could think about it as when is consumption exactly the same as my disposable income, I'd really be having the same value there. So now it's just a little bit of algebra, right? I would subtract, well, I'll do this first. Let's say I subtract this from both sides. So I've got C minus MPC times C is equal to autonomous consumption. I then kind of have C in both of these, so I can pull that out front. So our equilibrium kind of break-even level of consumption will be that autonomous consumption divided by 1 minus our propensity to consume. Okay. Now, just to make an additional point here, what's another way I could rewrite this function? My autonomous consumption, or that constant, well, what is 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume? We said the marginal propensity to consume and the marginal propensity to save always have to add up to 1. So this is another way of kind of thinking about it. Okay. So at this point, I've got the general form. I could just plug my values in, right? 0.7, 0.8, or this was 0.2, and I should be able to get that level of consumption. Now, if I didn't have the general form or I was kind of worried about it, I have here, well, at the break-even point, these two are exactly the same. So I would have kind of C is equal to 0.8 times C plus 0.7. I'm just doing the algebra here. C minus 0.8 times C is equal to 0.7. This would be what? 0.2 times C. And this would be consumption at that break-even point is 0.7 over 0.2, which is what exactly what we had up here. All right, let's see, got someone in the chat here. Is this consumption function the same as C and the C? Yes. All right. So I said for right now, we can think about this as any one consumer, But if we add all those up, essentially it's going to be the consumption that we see in our GDP calculation. Yep. So you're getting ahead of me a little bit, but we'll eventually get to that point here today. Okay. So this is what 3.5, if I'm doing the math in my head correct there. Sorry. Any questions on that? Okay. All right. So you can find these break-even levels of consumption. What if instead I had disposable income? What would my kind of current level of savings be? Right. So if I know my disposable income is 2.4, how much would my savings be? So here I can do something a little bit different, right? Because I'm not looking for the break-even point. So I've got the same setup, but I'm told my disposable income is 2.4. Now we just said the break-even point is 3.5. Okay. So I want to think about visually using that graph that we had before. And we've got, so here's like our disposable income. Here's our level of consumption. We just found that break-even point was 3.5. So if we're at a level of disposable income that is lower, I think in this problem I told you it was 2.4, what's going to be the case? Well, my actual consumption is greater than my disposable income, in which case, if I'm buying more than the income I have, my savings there is going to be negative. Okay? So we can go through and kind of show this, right? So if my consumption was equal to 0.8 times this disposable income that we were given plus autonomous consumption, right? Then our level of consumption would be what? 0.8 times 2.4 plus 0.7, or approximately 2.62. Well, that's the amount of consumption we have, right? But savings would be what is my disposable income minus how much I'm spending. So in this case, 2.4 minus that 2.62, I get that savings would be approximately negative 0.22. Now, obviously, we're dealing with small numbers here, but this could represent like trillions or kind of whatever that unit we want is. But that's how we would go about solving this with any set of numbers. Okay. And this might help you, right? If you can find the break-even point, what if instead, I must have left the cap off of this. There we go. What if instead I was looking at disposable income of 5.2? Well, there I'm above the break-even point, so the amount that I'm consuming, right, is actually less than, sorry, the amount that I'm consuming is actually less than my disposable income, in which case means my savings must be positive, right? Savings is equal to whatever my income is minus the amount of consumption that I have. Right? Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay, just make sure there's nothing in the chat there. All right. So we just worked through kind of this problem. So now we're going to transition kind of the question that was just previously asked, right? So this consumption, right, is essentially going to be part of our GDP calculation. And we're going to think about now disposable income is not like at the individual level, disposable income or the total amount of value we have in our economy is going to be our GDP. So we can kind of think about it as our total kind of disposable income is going to be equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. That was our GDP calculation using, the expenditure approach. Okay. So how can I find my break-even level of consumption here? Well, if I have this as my consumption function, right, I'm essentially going to plug this in to consumption and then try to solve for this equilibrium disposable income which would be where all of our expenditures are equal to what we're producing, or kind of that break-even point for the economy, or break-even real GDP. Right? So I'm going to give you here, we're going to assume that there's no taxes for a second. We'll eventually move to a more complicated and more difficult type of scenario where we do have taxes, but I'm telling you net exports, I'm telling you government spending, I'm telling you the level of investment, and I'm giving you a consumption function. Okay. So we're going to do the work here to solve for what that equilibrium level of disposable income or the equilibrium level of real GDP would be. Now, I'm making it simple here for the sake of what we're doing, but remember net exports, I could, instead of giving you that, tell you exports and imports, in which case you know net exports is exports minus imports. Okay. So let's instead kind of work through one where we're doing this. Right? So I've got my GDP, right, or my level of kind of disposable income in the economy is equal to C plus I plus G plus net exports. So our consumption function was 0.8 times that disposable income plus 0.7. We were told investments were 1.5, government spending 2.4, and net exports were 0.3. So in a lot of, these examples, we're going to have negative net exports because typically we see in larger economies, imports are larger than exports. Okay. So really at this point, it's just a matter of math, right? So I'll do this with the numbers for a second, and then I'll kind of show you what it would look like. Actually, yeah, I'll do it with numbers, and then we'll kind of look at more general forms. So if we were just solving for this one, right, to kind of make it easier, I'm going to add these values up. So I get what? 3.9, 4.6, so 4.3. That was just from adding these values up, just to make it a little bit easier to look at. From here, it's very similar to what we were doing before. I'm going to subtract 0.85 times the disposable income from both sides. So that break-even level of real GDP in our economy will be equal to this. Okay. Now, what was I doing really in this general form? So I actually had that marginal propensity to consume, that was our 0.8, times the level of disposable income, plus our autonomous consumption, plus I, plus G, plus net exports. So when I was adding all of these up, what I then had was that's where we were coming up with that 4.3. Okay. I then kind of subtracted this from both sides. I then pulled this out front. So I've got this here, and then I could have my disposable income was my autonomous consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net exports divided by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. That's all I'm doing here, right? Using the values, I think probably makes it a little bit easier, but the general form of this equation would look something like this. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving here? So I don't know, just to kind of make sure we've got the number here. So I had what? 4.3 divided by 1 minus 0.8. So this is what? 21.5. Okay. Any questions here before I make another point here real quick? Okay. All right. So I want to say a couple more things here before we move on. Just making sure there's nothing in the chat. So what we just found was given these values, we could think about what was our break-even level of disposable income, or can think about this as that break-even real GDP, where everything that's being produced is being consumed in our economy. So we had here, this is kind of our overall real GDP or our disposable income. The actual consumption we said initially is always going to be higher. And then eventually we find this break-even point, which was 21.5. So if I then gave you a second example, and I didn't tell you to solve, right, for what savings is, we kind of did that with a more simple version where we just had consumption. Really anything where that consumption level, or sorry, where that disposable income is less than our break-even point. So let's say 15. Well, that's going to result in a level of real GDP that is less than our consumption. So if real GDP or our disposable income is less than our actual consumption here, that means that we're buying more than what we have, or we're consuming more than the products that we've produced. So thinking about it here, if consumption is larger than the current income, or what I'm consuming is larger than my output, here I would have my savings is my disposable income minus consumption. But if consumption is larger, then this has to be less than zero, or I have negative savings. Right? And if I gave you a second scenario where I told you if the current level of disposable income is not 21.5, but it's 32, well, there, the actual level of consumption compared to the disposable income, it's less than, or sorry, my disposable income is greater than consumption, in which case my savings, which is my disposable income minus consumption, if this is larger, savings will be positive, and I have a positive amount of savings, okay, in my economy. Any questions there before we keep moving? So we can determine the level of savings if it's positive or negative once we find that break-even point, okay? So what if instead, I can get my slides, so there we go. What if we have taxes, right? So same kind of setup, but I now have this value of taxes, which is told to me to be 0.8, okay? So our disposable income will be whatever level of income we're making. So this, once again, we can put this in a one person kind of lens. If I'm making $100, but I have to pay $20 in taxes, I only have left over $80 to spend. So there, the consumers, the amount of money or the amount of disposable income they have is whatever they're paid minus taxes. Or we can think about this as in our economy, whatever level of income we see, right? Minus taxes. So, or whatever our kind of current nominal, GDP is minus tax, or real GDP is minus taxes. So if I went through and kind of solved this one, right, we're going to go through what would this look like? So the setup is going to be very similar, right? So if I'm thinking about what were we doing before, we said our overall kind of level of real GDP or disposable income we had in our economy was our consumption, which we had 0.8 times disposable income, right? But now my disposable income is the amount of money I'm making minus taxes, right? And then add in autonomous consumption, right? So now we've got consumption is equal to our marginal propensity to consume times this plus autonomous consumption. And then we had plus I plus G plus net exports. So just plugging in the values that we had, we're going to end up with what? 0.8 times Y minus 0.8 times T plus 0.7. I think we had investments were 1.5, government spending was 2.4, net exports was 0.3. Now here, what we're thinking about is we're trying to solve for this break-even level. So you can think about it here. We've kind of replaced YD, right? Disposable income is the amount of income minus taxes. So you can think of this as just the overall level of GDP in our economy, kind of making that, that notation the same. We're solving for this break-even level of income, but now including that there's taxes that exist. So here, you can think about what am I going to do? And I think the value I gave you for taxes was also 0.8. So really, it's going to be very similar. We just have a sum of all these things. We just have to make sure that when we're adding in taxes, it's a negative value, right? So we're going to kind of have still the sum of all these things. It's just that taxes are getting taken out. Once again, I can pull the y out front here. What was this equal to? 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume, right? I divide both sides by that. And what I'm left with is I would have, and I could kind of rewrite these things in just in general terms. This is really at this point, just kind of getting this entered into our calculator. Um, so let me see, what did I have there? We've got 4.3, so minus 0.8 times 0.8. So if we're taking taxes out, we get now, this should be, I think, approximately 18.3, right? So let me make sure I've got all those values in there. So we have what? 3.9, 3.6, 4.3. Wait, I might have forgot my negative sign. Hold on. Nope, that should be right. Yep. So I have that value, but if I'm just writing this out in like general terms, like what did all these numbers represent? Well, I'll kind of rewrite this just in order. I think it'll help. We had autonomous consumption, that was our 0.7. We then added in our investments, our government spending, and our net exports. The only difference is now, compared to what we were doing before, is we also have to subtract our marginal propensity to consume times whatever the value of taxes were. Generally, I'll kind of use T to kind of notate that. And then we had divided by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. Now, once again, if I didn't tell you the marginal propensity to consume, we always know that that would be equal to 1 minus our marginal propensity to save. So if I gave you the marginal propensity if I gave you the marginal propensity to save, you could always back out what that marginal propensity to consume was. Okay. Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So I think at this point, let me make sure there's nothing else that I want to do here. So we'll talk about this. I'll come back to this, I think. Oh, there you go. Yeah, we'll talk about this here in a second. I want to work through some more examples in that Excel file and maybe show you how you could set this up to maybe be more helpful to see if things changed, right? So let's go to, this is going to be too big. No, perfect. So I kind of had some hypothetical values here. We could kind of work through these for the sake of time. Um, I think I had this kind of set up to have similar values, but I changed these a little bit. So when we're thinking about our equilibrium level of real GDP, this is going to be taking whatever consumption is, right? Or sorry, whatever our consumption level was, plus investments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we could kind of calculate what that is. I'm going to do kind of a different one here, where let's think about we have this overall level of consumption, right? So I've got 200. I've got my kind of investments, my government spending, taxes, and then net exports. So I'm thinking about C here. What I actually want to do is kind of how do we solve for this equilibrium level of GDP. This is actually representing not the overall level of consumption, but autonomous consumption. Okay. So we're kind of finding this break-even GDP or my equilibrium GDP levels. So we said, what is that going to be? Well, that's going to be take my autonomous consumption, add my investments, my government spending, and my net exports. This is what these four cell references represent. Okay. Now, the next part is going to be, well, what did we have? We had minus our taxes times our marginal propensity to consume. So that was our numerator. We then divided all of that by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. So this should give us, this is the general form. I could change these values, and this should always give me my break-even level of GDP. Okay. So what happens, I'm going to make this point here for a second, but what happens if instead my marginal propensity to consume goes down? Right? Well, if I think about my equation here, right, and I'll kind of cut out to kind of show you some directional changes. If everything else stays the same, but my marginal propensity to consume goes up here. Right? For a second, we'll ignore taxes just to maybe make this a little bit easier. If my marginal propensity to consume goes up, 1 minus that is going to be a smaller value, right? So if people are spending more of their income, that means they're saving less, right? So if this decreases, if my denominator decreases, my break-even level of consumption will actually go up. Okay. So we can see this kind of play out in our Excel file because, oh, there we go. My old equilibrium, break-even point for GDP was what, 4,525. Let's say this goes up to 0.9. Well, we see that new break-even level is quite a bit higher. Okay. Any questions on that idea? Okay. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Now, I'll point something out here just in case you had some interest in it. If we do have taxes, the answer isn't as clear, although in practice, the relative size of our taxes are always going to be relatively small compared to everything else. So if I had my marginal propensity to consume go up, technically I would also have this increasing, which means I'm subtracting a larger amount, which would actually drive my real GDP down. I'll never kind of give you a question where I'm expecting you to kind of know the relative size of taxes to everything, every other expenditure. So here, any question I would ask you, and in these questions, I would likely say assume away taxes. You're just looking at kind of what the impact of that marginal propensity to change is in that denominator. Once again, if I asked you anything about the directional change of the break-even level of GDP, I would give you examples where you assume there are no taxes. But if I ask you to solve for the break-even level of GDP at one specific marginal propensity to consume, there I could give you examples where we include taxes. Okay. All right. So I want to do a little bit more in Excel here. I think I've got some slides that go along with this, but since we're here, we'll just kind of stay here for a second. So I've kept marginal propensity to consume the same. I've kept all these values the same. But what happens if the level of investment increases? Well, if the overall level of investment increases, then if we were using all of our resources in our economy, that, excuse me, actual level of real GDP should go up, right? Which means that in order to kind of get our disposable income to match that level of consumption, we'd have to consume more. All right. So that increase in I would increase our real GDP, in which case, if consumption is equal to that, consumption would have to be higher than it was before. Sure enough, I've got the same equation here, but I've now had my investments go from 600 to 800. Okay. So if I make this calculation, notice what's the change in my real GDP? Well, when investments go up by 200, my real GDP break-even point actually goes up by 1,000, right? So it's not as easy as the change in real GDP will not be equal to the change in I, or I could think about the change in G, change in autonomous consumption, change in the exports. In fact, that change in that break-even level of GDP, when investment goes up, it's going to be even larger, right? Instead of a 200 increase, here our GDP from that $200 increase in investment actually increased our GDP by 1,000, right? So it's increasing by a different factor. And we'll talk about this factor here in a second. Any questions on that before we keep moving? Okay. So I'm going to make sure I save this since we're at this point. I'll upload this that has like any of the in-class work that we're doing here today. So what are some of these things that would shift kind of consumption, right? So we think about this break-even level. I said increases in I. We just worked through an example where we saw that would increase this break-even point. But what are the other things that are in that numerator that also would kind of increase the break-even point? Well, it would be government spending, net exports, excuse me, or autonomous consumption. So what's going to shift my kind of break-even level of consumption up or down, or what's going to shift my overall level of consumption to be higher or lower? So if we have increases in population, once again, we're looking at moving from like one consumer's lens to the entire economy. Then if we have more people, if the marginal propensity to consume, we assume right now it's the same for all individuals, that should then, if we have more people, increase the overall level of consumption or shift our consumption kind of curve upward. And I'll kind of show you this here in a second. If we have more wealth, this is essentially more disposable income. We're also going to see consumption go up. That's just our basic consumption function. If we plug in disposable income times marginal propensity to consume, with more wealth, consumption would increase. Right? Now, how could this occur? Excuse me. If we had higher inflation, right, prices are going up, we can think about wealth as really the real value of our income. So if inflation is higher, prices are higher, the real value of our income is lower, which would actually shift consumption down. So the reverse of that would be if we have lower inflation, that increases the real value of our income, which then would increase the overall level of consumption. So increases in wealth, increased consumption. How do we see an increase in wealth? Lower inflation. If we had higher inflation, that actually decreases wealth and then decreases consumption. Okay. If we have future income expectations, so once again, they could be higher or lower. We said if I think I'm going to have more money in the future, what do I do today? So this kind of lines up with previous modules. If I think I have more money coming in tomorrow, I'm going to spend more today. So that would increase my consumption. So this is the idea that college students, right, you don't have generally higher levels of income, but you expect once you get your degree to have more income in the future. So you spend today as though you already have that money. And then the reverse would be true as well. We also can think about how do interest rates influence consumption? Well, if consumers face higher interest rates, that means it's more costly to borrow. That means when we're talking about like even if I have $0, I could take out loans. Well, if interest rates are higher, I'm less likely to take out loans of higher values and I can't consume as much today. So higher interest rates actually make savings more valuable, making borrowing more costly, and we would actually see a decrease in consumption. If rates were lower, borrowing is less costly. People will borrow more money. They'll spend a proportion of that based off their marginal propensity to consume. So lower interest rates would actually increase consumption. So once again, this is very similar to what we talked about in the previous module. We're just applying it to a slightly different model. And then taxes, hopefully we could kind of see when we're looking at that tax equation. Oh, where did I have it? There we go. The amount of income that we really have to spend, our disposable income, is how much money we're making minus taxes. So if taxes go up, we have less money to spend, right? So if taxes are higher, that's actually going to decrease consumption. If taxes are lower, we have more money to spend that's going to increase consumption. And then the same kind of thing would line up if we had tax expectations. It's just kind of the same idea. If I have more wealth or more income, it has the exact same effects on current consumption as if I expect higher or lower future income. Higher or lower taxes have the same effect on current consumption as expecting higher or lower taxes in the future. Okay. Any questions on this? So basically, all of these increases in income, all these things that we talked about, all of these changes in consumption, right? We're really thinking about all of these were impacting how much money we have to spend or we're impacting our disposable income. So if any one of these things changes such that it increases the amount of disposable income we have to spend on products, we would also see an increase in consumption. Those kind of two things go hand in hand. So I don't think there's really anything new here that we haven't talked about before in module 6. I guess we didn't focus as much on taxes, so that's kind of a new component we're adding in. But otherwise, interest rates, expected income, more people, changes in wealth, all of this I think is nothing new. Right? So the next thing that we'll kind of think about here was our break-even point before. If I have any one of these changes, so this is where maybe in a problem I tell you there's more people in the economy. Well, you know there's an increase in population. That should increase the overall consumption. So what that would do is at every level of disposable income, I have more people who are able to spend money that would increase my consumption at every level of kind of average disposable income across my consumers. So if I saw an increase in my consumption, where is my new break-even point? Excuse me, the new point where actual consumption hits my possible, if you want to think about like here, this 45-degree line, this was where all of my income is being consumed. So this would be like if we were taking all of our resources and buying products. So the point where you know, where we would be spending all of our income hits actual consumption. So like C1 and 2, C2 and C1 would be like the actual consumption levels compared to what consumption could be if we were spending everything. So a marginal propensity to consume of 1, essentially. So here, increases in consumption, that break-even level of GDP in our economy, oh, I went too far, is going to now be higher. Okay. Oh, got a fire alarm or something going off here. Sorry. Probably means it's what, 12 o'clock? Yep. Any questions? Oh, I see something here in the chat. Wouldn't increases in consumption cause a rightward shift? So here we're not looking at prices and output, right? Or we're not looking at prices and real GDP. What's on our axis here? Here we can think about this as like how much money we have to spend, and here's our actual consumption. So it's a completely different graph. So the reason why this looks like a leftward shift is because in order to get that same amount of consumption, well, if I have more people, I don't need disposable income to be quite as high, right? Because even if disposable income is lower, if I have more people, a smaller number is getting multiplied by an even larger number. We should, to get that same level of disposable income with more people, I actually don't need them to spend as much. Or thinking about it, I think an easier way to think about it is at the same level of disposable income, I'd be taking that and multiplying it by the number of consumers I have. So that would be my overall level of consumption. Well, if I have more people, right, then at that same level of disposable income, that's getting multiplied by a higher number of individuals, that would raise the overall consumption I see or actual consumption in my economy. So it's a little bit different in the other model because our axis has changed. It's no longer prices on the y-axis. Any questions on that? And sorry, hopefully this siren stops here in a little bit. Okay. So what if instead we were thinking about, all right, consumption can change, but so can other factors that we had into real GDP. So actual investment, right, or our I is going to be the planned investment we had plus unplanned, right? Unplanned investment are going to be things like if inventories changed and we weren't expecting that, then um, you know, that's an actual, have more than I thought I was going to have before, right? So if I have more in my inventory, right, I actually have invested into more products. If you want to think about it that way, it would increase my actual investment, right? It's kind of like higher inventory I have, the more I have available to sell in the future. And so it's kind of like our price expectations. Even though I don't have products I'm currently selling, I expect to be able to sell them in the future. And so actual current investment would increase. Right? Same kind of idea. How would interest rates influence investment? Remember, C is coming from like consumers, consumption. I, it's investments made by companies. You want to think about it that way. So for them, interest rates work in the exact opposite direction. If there are higher interest rates, that's a good thing if I'm putting money into products and I'm getting a return, right? So if I'm investing in the products and the interest rate is higher, I'm going to get a higher return or investment should increase. On the flip side, if interest rates are lower, well, making the same investment is going to pay out a lower amount. That's actually going to decrease how likely I am to make these investments. So lower real interest rates will decrease investment. So it's the exact opposite impacts than it had on consumers. Excuse me. Okay. And then kind of similar to income, if I expect to have higher profits in the future, I'll be able to make more current invest, or I would make more, increase my investments today or increase my current investments. It works the same way as if I actually have higher profits today. Okay? And then increases in technology. We've talked about this kind of makes every investment I make into physical capital, it makes my physical capital more efficient. So improvements in technology would increase investment. And then taxes, similar thing. So if instead of taxes on consumers, so you can think about the taxes I was talking about in our previous example, that was like a sales tax on consumers. If I have business taxes, right, or maybe if I'm producing oh, what's the hot button issue? Right? All these large plants that are generating that are being used for like AI, and if they cool them down with a bunch of water, maybe the government starts taxing them. So we have business taxes. Well, increase in taxes on businesses means they expect their profits to go down, which means they'll make fewer investments today. On the flip side, if I had lower taxes, right, or I expect lower taxes in the future, I now have more money to invest, or I would see increases in planned investment. So we've got shifters of consumption, shifters of investment. Right? I can think about any time my real interest rate, just to kind of connect this to here, if my real interest rate is lower, I'm actually going to, excuse me, what do I want here? Sorry, this was actually not on the right slide. This was supposed to be on my this was supposed to be on my consumer slide because lower interest rates should mean that we're actually increasing consumption. The exact opposite would be true. I should have an upward sloping supply curve here. So sorry, I'll change my slides here. This should have been on the previous slide. If we're thinking about instead, I'm gonna have to draw this out for us since we're here. So that should be on my consumption slide. For investments, right? If I think about the overall level of investments I'm making, well, they're higher real interest rates or kind of higher interest rates that are paying me a return on what I'm investing, the higher they are. So here, the higher interest rates are, the higher the level of investment that companies or firms are going to invest. Okay. So I'll move that to my consumption slide and then kind of add in this onto the investment slide so that you kind of have an updated version of that moving forward. Okay. All right. So what does this look like? It's really the same thing as consumption, right? If I see an increase in investment, really I have this C plus I now, right? It's not just C, I'm adding in I and G. So increases in investment, no matter how that would shift, whatever that shifter was, if it increases investment, once we add that in, we're seeing our break-even level or our kind of equilibrium level of real GDP also goes up. And that makes sense. When we were calculating real GDP with C plus I plus G, any increase in I gets kind of added in. We would see kind of higher level of break-even real GDP there as well. Okay. Now, what about in government expenses, taxes, and exports? Right. Well, if I think about it, what are my government expenses, right? Well, it's whatever they were before, but I'm also kind of having to pay, right? Anytime there's a tax, right? That's being paid out to someone. So I would kind of have taxes get added in here as well to my real GDP as well. Nothing, here I'll give you a visual to kind of help make a little more sense, right? So government spending, generally, it's always positive. We see that increases our real GDP function even more. Now C plus I plus G, we're going to get to a higher break-even point. Now net exports, why do I have this drawn in here, right? Why is it lower? Well, I mentioned that most often our net exports are negative. So if net exports are negative, that would actually shift our kind of real GDP calculation to be lower. If net exports do end up being positive, it would just shift this blue line to be even higher, right? I'll give you another way of thinking about this before we go to equations. So let's assume, and this is where I might be a little bit more in depth when we have problems. So let's say I've got, here was kind of when we had consumption, disposable income. This is when our economy is spending or consuming all of our, we're purchasing all the resources we have available, right? Or all of the income we have available is being spent on consumption. And here I could even think about, we're not just looking at consumption now, kind of thinking about what that real GDP or what total consumption is, right? So my real GDP is equal to total consumption, which is C plus I plus G plus net exports. So let's assume that my current consumption plus investments plus government spending is right here. Okay. I could do something like this where I said, okay, if exports are equal to, and I just gave you some numbers, 400, imports are 500. My net exports here would be my exports minus imports. So this would be what? Negative 100. In which case, when net exports get added in, I'm actually looking at a lower amount, which pushes my break-even level of real GDP to be lower than it was before. Okay. Now, what if I then said, just a hypothetical, that all of a sudden imports go down? I don't give you a value, I just tell you that they've decreased, right? Well, if my imports go down, net exports are going to increase, which would actually shift this real GDP function kind of back up, or the actual level of current expenditures to be higher. So it could be up here, in which case my GDP was even higher than it was before. Now it could just shift it up a little bit, in which case I don't know if it's higher or lower than my old level, but I do know that if imports go down, that break-even level of real GDP compared to that original scenario with these values, I know that's going to be a little bit higher than before. And that would be like if imports instead were, 300. Now instead of subtracting 100, I'm adding 100 in. Okay. Any questions on this idea? Okay. Where are we at in time here? All right. So let me make sure we have enough time. So might have to spill over a little bit into Monday's class with Module 7. I was kind of hoping we got through most of it today. But for the sake of time, what do I want to do here? I think we'll have time to get through this. But just in case we don't, I want to make sure we've got plenty of time to kind of work through this daily quiz. Okay. So let me put a time limit on this. And then we'll take a look at these questions together. Okay. So here we're thinking about the marginal propensity to save, and I'm giving you an autonomous level of spending. What's my break-even real GDP? So this should be going back a ways in today's class, so it shouldn't be too bad. So we'll work through this one first, and then we'll kind of look at one, okay, what if government spending increases? But what if we also have taxes decrease? Excuse me. Um, so what do I have here? Increase in this one. Oh, okay. We'll also think about the second part as well. So for this first part, we haven't quite gotten there today, but I'll show you something that we did talk about that can help us answer this. Um, so let's say I look at my first problem, and then we'll kind of move to the next one, and I'll try to set us up for next class. So remember, we said consumption was equal to our marginal propensity to consume times the disposable income plus autonomous consumption. So here we are told, or autonomous spending. So here we were told that autonomous consumption or spending was 900. Now I was told my marginal propensity to save was 0.16. So what is my marginal propensity to consume? Well, it's going to be 1 minus that marginal propensity to save. So this is what 1 minus 0.16 should be 0.84. So I'd plug this in here. Now to solve for my equilibrium kind of GDP, it's just rearranging this equation a little bit. Now, when we had this more simple example, remember we said, how do I actually solve for that equilibrium level of real GDP? It was autonomous consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. We had some taxes in here. We'll assume no taxes just for right now. We then had that was divided by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. So if I give you a more simple example, I could give you these additional values, but here we're just thinking about if we just are looking at consumption and we don't have any of these other factors in our economy, all we would have here is autonomous consumption. So here it should be what? 900 over 0.84, which if I'm doing this math here, so what? 900 divided by 0.84 should be what? 1,071. Should I get this entered in here, right? Yeah. So, oh, what did I do? Why did I make a mistake here? What is my break even? So I had 900 was my autonomous
Should be
spending.
divided by 0.16, right?
Oh, yep, sorry. I I changed this at the last minute. I forgot to update the answers because I know that I have a question in the quiz where I don't give you the marginal propensity to consume. So sorry. So this is how I would solve it if I gave you the marginal propensity to save. If I gave you instead, let's say I told you the marginal propensity to consume was instead 0.16, then you would have, oh, what did I want here? Sorry, I did have this set up correct. I just did math in my head wrong, right? So this would be 900 over 0.16, which should give us 5,625. Okay. So I could give you the marginal propensity to consume, or I could, like in this one, give you that marginal propensity to save, in which case you have to solve for the marginal propensity to consume and then plug it in. But notice, what is my marginal propensity to save? It's 1 minus my marginal propensity to consume. So that actually ends up being the same value. So it doesn't matter how I do that. I could give you either one and you could solve for this break-even point. All right. So in the second one, um, I told you that there's an increase in government spending, and I wanted to know, will its impact on this break-even level of GDP be more or less than the same decrease in taxes? So I'm going to give you these answers and we'll kind of work through it. So this first one should be more than, right? And then the second part is that same increase in real GDP caused by government spending could be caused by which of the following, right? So here. increase in real GDP could be caused by I'll give everybody credit for the second one because I had something, I had the first choice as the option, and that's not what it is. So sorry, I want to make sure I'm giving everybody credit for this one before we work through it. So that second response should be more than, and then it should be, where's my options? A decrease in imports. Okay. So we'll kind of walk through why here in just a second. Okay. So you're getting that submitted in time. We kind of had that second part or that second question was more than, and then a decrease in imports. And we'll kind of talk through why here in a second. Okay. So if we have the more complicated version of this where we're factoring in everything, right? So we had my break-even level of real GDP was equal to autonomous consumption plus investments plus government spending plus net exports, which were my exports minus my imports. Right? And then we also had, we're going to subtract whatever my marginal propensity to consume was times whatever taxes are. Right? So we go back and then we divided that all by 1 minus our marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So this will kind of lead us into what we're going to talk about next class, which is our changes in any one of these factors. What impact would they have on the break-even level of real GDP? Well, we worked through some values earlier and we saw that when investment went up by 200, the change in our break-even point was like 1,000, right? It was even larger. So why is that the case? So if any one of these components change, we're essentially thinking about what was the change in that break-even point or taking a derivative of that in respect to whatever is changing. So here, if I think about government spending, if everything else stays the same, but I'm looking at just government spending, I could almost think about this as like everything else is over here, but I pull out government spending. If this is what's changing, then the change in my real GDP would actually be, if I take a derivative of this, 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So this would be the change in my real GDP from a change in government spending. So I think in this example, I didn't give you a specific marginal propensity to consume, right? But you could think about, let's just assume to make this an easy value, let's do, say this was 0.8. This ends up being what? 5, if I'm doing math in my head correct. Now, what if instead I'm then asking you to compare this to a change in taxes? Well, a change in tax should have the same impact. It'd just be in the opposite direction if we didn't have the fact that consumers were spending only a certain proportion of their income. If they spent all of their income, marginal propensity to consume is 1, then changes in that tax are going to have the exact same changes as government spending would. But because it doesn't, right? If I took a derivative of this function in respect to taxes, what am I left with? Well, I actually have a negative sign here, so it's going to be negative marginal propensity to consume over 1 minus that marginal propensity to consume. Okay. So this is going to decrease, right? If I have an increase in taxes, that would actually cause my break-even real GDP to go down. If I have a decrease in taxes, right, subtracting a smaller value, that's actually going to cause my break-even level of GDP to go up. So it kind of has the opposite effects of, right, instead of an increase in government spending that increased the break-even point, increases in taxes actually lower it because now people have less money to spend. Now you also notice what's going to be true here. I could go through the actual math. So I'd have what, 0.8. And if I don't care about the directional change, I'd have 1 over 0.8. So this is going to be what, 4. So that change that's coming from taxes, right, will always be less than the change that comes from any one of these other components because they're not getting multiplied by the marginal propensity to consume, taxes are. And the marginal propensity to consume is always less than 1. So the numerator here would always be a little bit smaller, making that kind of impact on real break-even real GDP a little bit lower. So next class, we'll kind of give some specific names to this, but these values are going to be what we call the multiplier effect, right? And the multiplier effect essentially tells us how much will this real GDP change by from a $1 change in government spending? How much will real GDP, this break-even point, change by from a $1 increase in taxes? And that change will always be less when I'm looking at taxes compared to any one of these other components. So that change in real GDP from government spending larger than the change that comes from a $1 increase in taxes. Okay. Any clarification on that before we keep moving here? Okay. Now, the second part of the question is going to be what's going to happen to that break-even level of GDP? What would be a change that could cause that same, oh, here, sorry, marker here, would cause the same change as that government spending did. So for every $1 we spend on government spending, real GDP or the break-even level goes up by 5. So what would produce the same change there? Well, if we had an increase in autonomous consumption, because if we take a derivative in respect to them, we're going to be left with 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume for each one. So all of those would have the same effect as a $1 increase in government spending. Okay. Now, what won't have the same effect? Well, we already said taxes, but here I think one of the potential options is so like a decrease in any one of these wouldn't have the same effect. It would actually not increase real GDP, it would decrease it. So that's why decrease in investments, decrease in really, I didn't tell you any of the ones, but decreases in autonomous consumption, decreases in exports would all actually cause it to go in the opposite direction. If I have a decrease in taxes, we said that does, it's going to have a smaller effect. And then increases in disposable income. Well, disposable income here isn't part of our equation, right? That's already being factored in, right, to this break-even level. Okay. Now, the only option left we have that should be the correct answer. I'll get this kind of updated after class, but it should be a decrease in imports. Why? Right? Well, if I think about what's that change in my real GDP coming from a change in imports, well, it's still going to be 1 over 1 minus the marginal propensity to consume. But notice on imports, there's a negative sign, right? So to get that same $5 increase from a $1 change in government spending, imports would have to change by $1, right? Because this would still give me 1 over 0.8, 1 over 1 minus 0.8, which would be 5, but there's a negative sign out front. So I actually wouldn't need an increase in imports to get that same effect. I'd actually need imports to go down, right, instead of up. So there, kind of the directional change matters when we're thinking about imports because they're not getting added in, they're getting subtracted. In the earlier examples that are a little easier, I was just giving you net exports. So that was kind of all being baked into one. But here, if I'm thinking just about imports, if I want to increase my real GDP, I actually would need a decrease in imports. Okay. So this change is representing what's the change in real GDP from a $1 increase in imports. Well, that would actually lower my GDP by that factor of 5. So how do I raise it? I actually need to not spend one more dollar. I need to spend one, fewer. I need to decrease the amount I'm spending by 1. That would then cause my real GDP to go up. Okay. So to kind of think about it here, how would I get an increase in my break-even level here? I would actually need a decrease in imports. Okay. Any other questions on that? Throw in one more thing before we end class here today. Okay. So let me go. There we go. So we'll kind of walk through this example at the beginning of next class. So we thought about how does a change in investment, so this is kind of similar to government spending or net exports, how did that change my equilibrium GDP? Then what if we had that same kind of, what if we had a change in taxes, right? How would that actually influence the real GDP and what would the change in GDP be there? So we'll kind of work through both of these or we'll work through this example at the start of class on Monday. We'll talk a little bit more about, well, what are these changes? Why are they different? And what can we call um, this factor, right, that they're causing real GDP to change by? We'll call that the multiplier effect. So that's really not going to take us, if we look at slides here, that won't take us a whole lot of time to get through this. I then kind of have one more thing we'll think about, which are adjustments in prices. So we primarily should be done with module 7 within the first 15, 20 minutes of class on Monday, which means we're going to start module 8. So what I'm going to do after class today is post and have set to release that module 8 top hat reading. That'll be due before we start class on Monday. Okay. So we're going to mainly be starting and working through module 8 material on Monday. We will then go through module 8 and complete it on Tuesday of next week. So next week's going to look a little bit different, and I'll post an announcement about this, but I'm not going to be able to do a recording next Wednesday. So what I'm going, which should just hopefully, like I said, we'll have plenty of time to get through module 8 on Monday and Tuesday. So we would usually do a review on that Wednesday and Thursday and have that second exam next Friday. What I'm going to do is post a recording of me working through some of these practice problems on, I'm going to do it ahead of time and post it Wednesday. And then Thursday, we'll have kind of live class as usual. And that's where you can kind of log on and ask any questions that you have that I didn't go through or didn't answer on Wednesday's video. Any questions you have over the practice problems, or what if this changed? How would I kind of solve this? So that'll be like a live review on Thursday. And then the Wednesday review will be something I pre-record, going through some questions that I, once again, hint, hint, might think will be helpful on that second exam, which is next Friday. Okay. And then one more thing, on Monday, well, I'll post it Monday after class, will be the next Canvas discussion. Its due date won't be until after the second midterm, so you'll have you know, more than a week. I think I'm going to set it to be due that following Tuesday. So, once you get done with these, if you want to work on it early, you can. If you don't want to work on it until after the exam, you'll have plenty of days to kind of get on it completed. I'll walk through that more on Monday when I post it. But that's kind of the roadmap for where we're going in this next week. Okay. So I'm going to end the recording here. And if you have any questions over material or anything that I just outlined, you can then ask it.